Hello, one and all. Today, 31st July, whole Hindi world is celebrating 140th birth anniversary of Munshi Premchand, or Upanyas Samrat as he is better known. Today, in this occasion, I would like to recall how the author's works resonate still after so many years of his death. Premchand was a trendsetter. He was totally different from his contemporary writers. That's what makes Premchand different. His style of writing was as traditional as it could be, yet his themes were as contemporary as it could be. You go through his works, you will see the way he analyzes the situations. It was like you feel, oh, he is a humanist or a political scientist, or maybe a blend of both. That's what makes Premchand special. That's why he is the unsung hero of Hindi literature. No wonder he is called Upanyas Samrat. The themes he chose at those days, that is in the 1930s, it still resonates. He was advocate of peasants. He talked about caste hierarchy. He talked about women. He talked about situations of women. He talked about widow remarriage. He wanted to abolish child marriage. And he even talked about live-in relationships in those days. His story, Miss Padma, it's about a live-in relationship. In 1930s, no one even dreamt of live-in relationship. And his story Jwalamukhi, it talked about zombies. Hollywood made a film on zombies in 1950s and Premchand wrote about it in 1930s. So that's the difference. So Premchand was a trendsetter and he was a man who struggled throughout his life. For everything he used to struggle, like his childhood was very much of a tragedy, like his parents passed away very early and whatever he learned by himself. He mastered Urdu, he mastered Hindi, and it is said he used to write his character sketch of novels in English. That's what makes Premchand different. All this he did when there was no possibility of Google search, no online platforms. All this he did in 1920s, 30s. That's what makes Premchand different. And what struggle he took to maintain his press. He used to own a press and that was fully in debt. But still he managed to publish a magazine, Hans. It was his favorite project. Yet he had to face many hardships, mainly from the British. His Soje Watan was burned. Just imagine thousands of copies of Soje Watan, and in those times it was so difficult to publish something. It was charged of sedition. The Britishers charged sedition and he was asked not to write. But then he started writing in pseudonym Premchand. He actually wrote in Urdu and he used the pseudonym Nawab Rai. But later, when the Britishers banned his book and banned him from writing, this did not deter that small man from a small village named Lamhi in Varanasi. And that is why his works still resonate among us readers. And that is why his works are still reread. The text is again and again reread, and so many allegations are also coming recently in Facebook and all, but that doesn't make Premchand a bit less than what he was. That's why he is celebrated and he is considered as the Upanyas Samrat. So let's have a look what actually he was.
31st July is celebrated as the birth anniversary of a great novelist and celebrated storyteller Munshi Premchand. Premchand's creative output, which is immense, considering he died when he was 56, has made him a great writer in two languages, Urdu as well as Hindi. His writings in many ways introduced realism in Hindi literature and held a mirror to the prevalent socio-economic times. He has been one of the pioneers of depicting the follies of Indian society and portraying the hardships of the poor and the common man in most of his writings. His birthday brings in another chance to remember his prolific work and made the legend of Premchand's love for the common man continue. Premchand's stories, despite being simple, have touched lives, and he was a man who wrote for a social cause. Unlike other writers of his time, that is in the early 20th century, who opted for imagery, Premchand used realism in his works. His writings highlighted the plight of the poor, the ugly reality of colonial India, religion, India's freedom struggle, and other topics on nationalism and public awareness. He was one of the first authors to write about caste hierarchies and the plights of women and laborers prevalent in the society in the late 1880s. Premchand is unmistakably for the poor, more particularly for the peasantry who bore the brunt of colonial exploitation. No wonder, whenever there is a discussion about Indian literature, the mention of Premchand is mandatory. He is regarded as the most important literary figure of the last century. Born on 31st July 1880 in Lamhi, a small village located near Varanasi, Uttar Pradesh, he was named Dhanpat Rai. His life was full of struggle and hardship, yet his love for knowledge made him the Upanyas Samrat of Hindi literature. He was a teacher for many years until he joined the non-cooperation movement led by Mahatma Gandhi and resigned from his job. Starting out as an Urdu writer, he wrote in the pseudonym Nawab Rai. In 1907, he published a collection of short stories called Soze Watan, gaining a lot of flak from the British Raj. Soze Watan was charged with sedition and its available copies were burnt by the British government for promoting patriotic feelings. The action did not deter him. He took on the pseudonym Premchand, and from then on, Nawab Rai became Premchand, and the rest is history. Some of his finest writings, written in the last 20 years of his life, show the influence of Mahatma Gandhi and the Russian Revolution in his choice of subjects. The need for widow remarriage, the rampant system of dowry and untouchability, the problems of landless laborers, the urgent need for land reforms, overworked salaried people who resort to bribery and corruption and social and class inequalities. His support for the Sharada Bill, which aimed to raise the age of marriage for girls and advocated the right to give widows a share of their late husband's property, finds reflection in many of his stories. On this July 31st, when it is his 140th birth anniversary, we recall how the themes of his work, as traditional as they were contemporary, continues to resonate years after he left us. While his style of writing belonged to an earlier era, his themes were much ahead of his time. His analysis of situations was almost as if he was a humanist and political scientist or a combination of both. Besides his contribution to Hindi and Urdu literature, Premchand's role in the Progressive Writers Association was indeed remarkable. October 1935, when a group of Turks in London drew up a manifesto of what would soon become the Progressive Writers Movement, Premchand published it in a slightly watered down version in his influential Hindi journal Hans in October 1935. And on April 9, 1936, when the Progressives decided to hold an All India Progressive Writers Association, Premchand rose to the occasion. And Premchand was unanimously elected the first president of this All India Writers Association and wrote one of his finest pieces of his speech, as it is called Sahitya Ka Uddeshya, that is the aim of literature. And this speech was heard by a rapt audience comprising both young and established writers from across the country. In simple yet powerful words, the greatest storyteller of his time told his audience how good literature can only be founded on truth, beauty, freedom, and humanity, and that his definition of literature was simply the criticism of life. Premchand urged writers to discard individual and personal concerns and instead speak in a collective voice, taking upon themselves public and political roles. Literature, which had hitherto been content to entertain or at best educate, must now advance human knowledge and freedom. He redefined the parameters of beauty. The main aim of literature then was to refine the mind of the reader, while undoubtedly the aim of art was to strengthen one's sense of beauty. Art too must be weighed on the same scale of usefulness as everything else in life. That's what he said. Given the exigencies of our times, there can be no better way to celebrate Premchand's legacy on his 140th birth anniversary than to remember his words and to remind ourselves of the aim and purpose of literature. On the question of communalism, Premchand sounds so relevant today that one tends to forget that he said these words in the 1930s. This is what he said: communalism always seeks to project itself as culture. It is as if it was ashamed to appear in its true form, and so, like the ass that seeks to boss over the creatures of the forest by donning the skin of a lion, communalism seeks to adopt the disguise of culture. Hindu wants to preserve his culture eternally, and so does a Muslim. Both consider their culture as insulated from the other. They forget that there is neither a Muslim culture nor a Hindu culture. Now in the world there is only one culture, and that is economic culture. But we are still crying over Hindu and Muslim cultures, although culture has nothing to do with religion. Premchand's contribution to the evolution of the Hindustani language needs to be emphasized. He uses colloquial words and often words derived from the Persian language with equal ease. It is language like that of Premchand that the vast multitude of people use and enjoy. On his 136th birthday, Google Doodle celebrated Premchand. They said so. Today's homepage celebrated a man who filled many pages of a different kind with words that would forever change India's literary landscape. And the doodle was inspired from Premchand's last and most popular novel, Godan, which he penned in 1936. It shows the Upanyas Samrat bringing his signature working class characters to life. Premchand died on 8th October 1936 after several months of sickness and while still in office. On this occasion, when we are celebrating his 140th birth anniversary, what one must remember is his message to keep the intellectual integrity of the creative class, writers as well as artists, together. When we are threatened, we must not cow down. Premchand was the bearer of that message. Thank you.